And gradually, memorials were commissioned and constructed to the passengers, crew, musicians, and so on. One of the largest in the UK is to the ship's engineers, here in Southampton. A statue to Captain Smith was funded by private subscriptions and eventually erected in Lichfield, Staffordshire, a place with no particular link with him or the great ship. And this memorial is in New York City. It's a memorial lighthouse erected in 1913 to the memory of the officers, passengers and crew of the Titanic. This lighthouse stood above the East River on the roof of the old Seamen's Church Institute on South Street. And from 1913 to 1967, the time ball at the top of the lighthouse would drop down the pole to signal 12 noon to the ships in the harbour. This time ball mechanism was activated by a telegraphic signal from the National Observatory in Washington, D.C. In 1968, the lighthouse was moved to its present position as part of the entrance to the South Street Seaport Museum. New York has more memorials to the Titanic than any other city. Then there were the official inquiries, which give us most of our historical evidence of what actually happened on the night of April 14th.
There were two inquiries for the Titanic. The first one was in America, where they subpoenaed nearly all the crew, including Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of White Star Line, and the senator's report was that he personally was to blame, which was totally wrong. They also said that the ship was going too fast and didn't have enough lifeboats, although she was carrying more than the lifeboats required by the Board of Trade. There was a lot of problems with the detention of the crew in America, and after representations from the British government, most of the crew were allowed to leave except for the officers. Then, as they came back to England, another inquiry was opened. A lot of the crew were temporarily imprisoned for 24 hours in Plymouth. The unions managed to get them away from the Lapland, the ship that was carrying them, and after negotiations, the crew were sent home. The second inquiry was chairmaned by Lord Mersey in London, and their report was basically the same as the Americans. The ship was going too fast, she didn't have enough lookouts, and the captain ended up with the blame, which is, you know, standard. And White Star Line was very heavily censured over the loss of the Titanic. After the sinking, the ships were made to travel much farther south on the ice routes to lower their speed, to have lifeboats for all, and to maintain much better lookouts. In 1991, another government inquiry was instituted because of the finding of the Titanic, where Captain Lord said she was. Nobody believed at the time. Captain Lord, who was captain of the Californian, said that the Titanic was 19 miles away from where he was. In fact, when they found her, she was 19.7 miles, so his navigation was spot on. And the family tried to clear his name. So the government instituted another inquiry. The report came out in April of 1992, and the report states that the ship was in the correct place, but because of the unbelievable clarity of the night, Captain Lord's ship did actually see the Titanic's rockets, but also stated that even if he had steamed at full speed, which obviously he couldn't do because he was in the middle of pack ice, he wouldn't have arrived any sooner than the Carpathia.
Many survivors gave evidence at those first inquiries, and then they got on with their lives.
When we got to New York, the people were very good to us, the people in New York. We went to the Junior League overlooking the river, and then they took me over to the shop and bought me a fur coat and a pair of shoes, which I hardly got. And then we went to Seattle, where my father was going to take over a hotel over there. Because when Father got drowned, and all that was cancelled, you see. So my mother booked a passage back to South Africa. So we went back to Cape Town.
My father's sister lived in New York, and the plan was that we were going to stay with her for, I think it was 3 or 4 days, and then get the train through to Canada. So of course she met us, and we were whisked straight off to her home. And I was ill. I had, when they threw me from one boat into the other, they bruised me very badly right across, and I had lots of bouts of sickness, so they took me straight away into a hospital to have a look at me. And so I didn't see really much of the furore, actually. And we came back home quite quickly. Now, coming home, my mother went to bed every night and slept. I was the one that was a terror coming home. I wouldn't come out of the cabin. She lured me up onto the deck one day, and that was about all. Well, she came back to her parents, who of course were getting on. She was 50 by then, my mother. And we lived in this small town with my parents. And then I had a great musical talent, I was told. Anyway, I played the piano very well, and I taught. And at 18 I had my voice trained, and I did a lot of professional singing. And she died when I was 23, and I went off to Australia. Well, I went to Singapore to stay with her godson, who invited me to do that. And then I went on to Australia with the idea that I might live there. I wasn't sure. But I did a lot of singing, and even in those days I was singing on the radio in Australia, and that's a long time ago, 1929. And but I didn't like it well enough to want to live there, so I came back to England. And I came back to England, and I had 3 or 4 really bad colds, really bad colds, and I couldn't sing. And I lost a lot of engagements through not being able to go, and I thought, well, perhaps, I came back in the winter, you see, from this very warm climate. So I thought, well, perhaps I'd better do something else. So a friend of mine had a very large wholesale motor business, and so I joined him there and ran the wholesale department. Still did a lot of singing in the evenings and that sort of thing. And then, of course, when the war broke out, like everyone else, it wasn't a question of what I wanted to do. I was a single woman on my own, and I could very easily have been sent up to a munition factory in goodness knows where. So I went to the Ministry of Food, and I was the food officer for this borough, and I hated it. I dislike it. Filling in forms and answering questions, no good to me. So I got out of that and went to work in a factory where they were making not actually munitions, but parts for guns and for what we called bomb slips, or things that the bombs were slipped with, I suppose, out of the aeroplane. And I liked that. It was people, working with people. And the director let me join the Industrial Welfare Society and paid for my training. So I became an industrial welfare officer, and that I did to the end of my working days, which I loved because it was dealing with people. In addition to that, I was a magistrate, and I loved that too, because again, it's people. Now I'm so old I have to just sit and talk about it.
And shortly after the war, Walter Lord, researching his book, A Night to Remember, was trying to contact as many survivors as possible.
Eva Hart is a perfectly marvelous person. She was only 7 or 8, but she was extremely wide-eyed and alert, and remembered, I thought, very well particularly the awakening of her getting up, getting dressed, getting life preserver, getting it up on deck, being separated from her father, or when he put them in the boat, I think. And it was, she was just a wonderful source, and she liked talking about it. There were other wonderful sources. Renee Harris was a lady who was on board the Titanic with her husband, who was a theatrical producer. They were in the theater business, and they knew she had a sense of crisis and climax, and she later went into the theater business herself because she lost her husband on board.